Clouds were billowing over the moons tonight, obscuring the stars. They'd come rushing in from the ocean around sunset, and Moon felt the foreboding in their heavy darkness. She'd wanted to hunt early, to be back inside the safety of the castle walls before the weather turned nasty. For nearly an hour she'd waited for Darkstalker, had even called out to his mind a few times, but he didn't answer. With little choice, Moon went out and caught a large hare for her breakfast. But even in that short time she had been out, the wind had battered her. The weather had only gotten worse as the night went on, though not a single drop of rain was unleashed. Now only 2 hours till dawn, she wondered if the weather would beat itself against the castle during the day while she slept. Hopefully, tomorrow night would be better. Wandering through the castle, Moon tried to give herself simple tasks to occupy herself. Little things, like tidying away cobwebs or tearing down rotten tapestries, helped her to focus. That way she wouldn't be able to recognize her loneliness. Darkstalker had been absent all night long. She'd not seen a glimpse of his shadow nor received any message from him since yesterday. Moon guiltily fiddled with her silver earring. Had she pushed him too far yesterday? After he'd shown her his memories of Clearsight, he'd seemed very upset. She'd wanted to go and comfort him, apologize for demanding too much or crossing his boundaries. But she didn't know where to find him. So instead, she was left to haunt the castle aimlessly, alone. What made her loneliness worse was the idea that she'd awoken tonight expecting some contact from her friends via their magical messenger shell. Since its invention, they'd contacted her every night, but tonight they hadn't, and she couldn't help but wonder why. There was no use thinking in circles to make herself feel worse, she told herself. So, why not spend her night doing something useful? Darkstalker had said he'd wanted to carry on restoring the palace so that it was livable. Their work yesterday had already made a considerable improvement, so why not carry on their work now? Of course, Moon had no magic to make the big changes, but she could still do something. She came across an enormous room that she quickly deduced must have been some kind of office or study. A very lavish-looking one, if the faded rug and ornate decorations of carved animals on the walls, or enormous fireplace across from the desk were anything to go by. Moon immediately set to work clearing it out. Sweeping the floor, pulling down cobwebs, rooting out vines and other growth that had come through a broken pane in the window. She even set about cleaning the rug, but quickly gathered that it might be a waste of time. Finally, she came to the old desk. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Every inch of it was detailed with some kind of carving, whether that be of roses with wicked thorns or a scene that vaguely looked like the cityscape outside. It was also very large. Moon felt like a hatchling when she sat in the old stuffy chair behind the desk. She immediately went to make things clean, throwing out dried ink pots and pieces of parchments that had worn away into almost nothing. As she pulled open the top drawer on the right-hand side, there was a small thunk as something obstructed the opening. With a strong jerk of her arm, Moon forced it open. A piece of thin wood fell out of the top to land in the drawer, a bunch of scrolls falling with it. Bending down inside, Moon realized that there had been a false top, a secret compartment. Intrigued, she carefully collected up the documents that had been hidden away. They were old, but their hiding place had offered them great protection from the elements for the most part. They were surprisingly well preserved, enough that Moon could even read the writing. From the first few lines in the first scroll, Moon realized that these documents, this desk, this office, had once belonged to the Queen of the Nightwings. This had been her official study, where she'd conducted business and seen to matters at state that needed to be signed in private. Excited for what she might discover of the past, Moon read on eagerly. That excitement quickly vanished as she read the first scroll. It was a copy of orders Queen Vigilance was sending out to her troops on the front lines of the war. Her contempt for the Icewings was obvious in her words, but also came from her impatience, her demand for news. There was a list of details of what she wanted Darkstalker to do, the spell she wanted him to cast. Moon felt her mouth go dry, but tried to rationalize that he'd had no choice. These were direct orders from his queen, and they'd been at war. It brought little comfort. By looking at the date on the second scroll, Moon could cross-reference it with the memories Darkstalker had shared with her, and realized that this was a written account of a conversation Vigilance had had with Darkstalker soon after Foeslayer's death. She'd been unkind, to say the least. It was clear that he was grieving the loss of his mother, and Vigilance's paranoia was blatantly obvious. She callously tried to order Darkstalker to come up with bigger, scarier spells, using his grief to fuel him. When that didn't work right away, she moved on to threatening the lives of Arctic and Whiteout. Moon threw the scrolls away, loathing the Queen more and more with every line she read. But then the third scroll froze her blood in her veins. It was a warrant for Darkstalker's immediate arrest and execution. A note at the bottom of the page drew Moon's attention.
Our dream has failed. We end this foolish plan now.
Plan? What did that mean? The last document made Moon frown as she tried to discern what she was looking at. It was a list of names and their dates of their birth, with notes by each. Good wings, unrivaled naturally acquired strength, most intelligent of the year group. This list went back more than 200 years before Darkstalker's time. But as she read on, Moon saw these names being paired up with others, and the offspring they produced, with more notes and more precisely monitored breeding. And that's when it occurred to her. This was a breeding list. This was a breeding program. These dragons were specifically selected in order to be entered into this mysterious program, their training and lives controlled and their dragonets monitored and added to the research. Each dragon had a list of their pedigree, and some were selected to breed on and others discarded, like animals. Down towards the bottom came the name, Prudence, and then Foeslayer. Moon knew what she would find next, but she didn't want to see it. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She felt like she would be sick, but she was compelled to read on.
The correct genes have all been gathered in order to create the perfect specimen. All that remains is animus magic, and we shall craft the ultimate dragon, the ultimate weapon. Prince Arctic of the Ice Wings is the only suitable candidate at this time. Though it is feared crossbreeding inside the tribe might dilute our work, it is a risk that must be taken. Anything for the cause, for the program, for the tribe.
And then, set 2 years later, 2 offspring, 1 female, Whiteout, and 1 male, Darkstalker.
The male is born into 3 full moons. They shall be monitored and enfolded into the program. Finally, our end goal has been accomplished. The program was a success. Continental domination is now within our grasp.
All the pieces fell into place. Why Darkstalker was treated the way he was. The memories he'd avoided her seeing. Even how Vigilance had wanted him to marry her daughter to breed it into the royal family. He'd known. He'd known all along. Rage coursed through Moon's veins, so hot and bright, she thought for a moment she was on fire. Tears streamed down her face. Whether from the screams in her voice or in her mind, Darkstalker heard her. She felt him coming to her, worried and trying to get through to her. The emotional turmoil in her head must have been too thick for him to pierce through, for he seemed unaware of what had caused her distress. Perhaps some part of her should have found it sweet that even when he was depressed, he came running to her at the first sign of trouble. But right now, all she could think of was the horror of what she had just read. In the time it took him to come to her, she found more documents and hastily read through them, each one making her feel more nauseous. When he arrived, the large Nightwing burst through the doors, looking around frantically with wide eyes.
Moon? Moon!
He came to her side, gently shaking her shoulder, as she wouldn't look away from the scrolls in her talons.
What is this? What's wrong?
But then he caught sight of the document she held, and he froze. His mind, which had been trying to reach out to her, instantly withdrew and sealed itself away from her. His face went slack, his body unresponsive. Moon didn't know whether to find his complete shutdown concerning or not.
I know!
She extracted herself from his grasp and moved away, subconsciously putting the desk between them. She glared at him.
I know about the program!
He wet his lips, eyes flickering nervously, before he spoke.
Moon,
You're a liar!
A liar?
Vigorously, he shook his head.
No, Moon, I never lied.
No, that's right. You just manipulated me with half-truths. You let me see into your memories, made me think I could trust you, but you pulled me away from seeing anything that might compromise you.
It's not how it looks.
Oh, well, then care to explain this? Or how about this and this?
Balling the old parchment in her fist, she threw the first document at him. Each one she hurled at him, he flinched. Not from any pain, but from the shock of the violence with which she moved. The last scroll he caught and straightened it out between his claws. He briefly glanced over the words. A cold expression came over his face as he stared at it, one corner of his lip twisting into a sneer.
You were the result of some eugenics program! Bred for the purpose of NightWing domination over the continent. You conveniently left that out whenever you tried to convince me of your innocence.
Slowly, he looked up from the scroll and met her eyes. His expression was outraged. His talon closed into a fist around the scroll, shredding it with ease.
Are you angry at me for something that was completely beyond my control? I had no say in the way I was brought into the world, and I was the one who suffered under their abuses.
Moon took a deep breath, trying to calm down so she could make sense of this mess.
No, Darkstalker, I'm not angry at you for this. You have no idea how much I loathe every single one of them for what they did to you and the others in this horrible experiment. The Queen, your keepers, I hate them all.
And it was true. She'd seen in Darkstalker's memories how he'd been mistreated. She wanted to bring Vigilance and the others back from the dead just to claw their eyes out for what they had done.
No, I'm upset because you kept this from me. I asked you to tell me your story, to help me to trust you, and you kept the most important fact a secret. Again!
It was like finding out he was an animus again. The same sting of betrayal hurt somewhere deep in her heart.
Moon.
Darkstalker tried to step closer to her, distressed.
Certain things can't just be spilled out. There's a time and a place for it.
For every step he took towards her, she took one step to the side, circling away from him.
Well, I guess now is the time and place to spill it.
You don't want to know,
he said in a low voice. His eyes caught a withdrawal and stopped, physically closing himself off.
That's not for you to decide.
His nostrils flared, and his breathing grew heavy. Upset, he finally snapped.
Fine! You want to know about the program? About what they did? Some senile old seer called Omniscience passed down a half-baked prophecy that one Nightwing would be born to lead the tribe to great influence over the continent. Vigilance's great-grandmother decided to start a program to breed the perfect Nightwing. They selected from their finest stock, superior physical strength, higher than average intelligence, mastery in flight.
He began to pace across the room. Moon watched him, patient. A ball of dread sank in her stomach, but she remained where she was. She'd asked for this. She needed to hear it all.
Oh, it was very well put together at first. Nothing too severe, arranged marriages or even paying two candidates to reproduce. It wasn't until the process became more refined that things started to get nasty. Dragonettes snatched from their beds and parents paid off to stay quiet. Those who were part of the program were kept separated from the rest of society. Who they interacted with was closely monitored, their mates chosen for them very specifically. I even heard there was one decade where all the hatchlings that were deemed to be genetically unfit for the program's needs were terminated.
Choking on the bile and tears that suddenly sprang onto her, Moon turned away. In and out, she forced herself to breathe. The image of tiny dragon heads, killed in any number of ways, refused to leave her mind, and it made her want to vomit. The horror. How could someone do that? When she glanced back, Darkstalker was watching her, a look of "I told you so" written all over his face. Fortifying herself, Moon rooted her talons to the spot and nodded.
Continue.
After a second or two, he did.
Eventually they got close to what they wanted. The night my mother hatched, a storm blew over the moons, obscuring the lights. She was rendered powerless and had almost ruined the entire program. My grandmother had to argue adamantly for it to continue. The genetics were all there, she said, hidden within. My mother had to live her whole life with her superiors shamming her for being born without powers and therefore almost unusable. But she proved herself to them. She struggled and clawed her way to the top to show them that she wasn't useless. That's why she volunteered to personally go on the mission to the Ice Kingdom to seduce Arctic.
He snorted derisively.
Needless to say, the plan hadn't been for them to genuinely fall in love and start a war.
It was timed perfectly, so that any hatchling conceived would hatch around the time of the brightest night.
Indeed. And so, I was born, the progeny of over 200 years of selective breeding to create the ultimate Nightwing, the strongest telepath or seer. Even my physiology was carefully designed so that it would be naturally stronger and faster than any other Nightwing in existence. And animus magic was the last piece of the puzzle, to be sure that I could do anything my tribe desired.
Something dark, grieving, and angry came over his features. He glared out of the broken window, the slight light from the moon shining through the clouds exaggerating every shadow.
Imagine the disappointment of everyone involved when I was born male. Inferior. I should have been a footnote next to my sister, and you can bet they never let me forget it!
Opening his talon, the scraps of parchment that had been in his palm fluttered to the floor, limp and swept away easily in a breeze. Moon watched them fall. She wanted to go to him, to comfort him, but her trick earlier had worked a little too well. She was unable to move from her spot. No longer talking to her, Darkstalker stared out into the abyss and spoke as if the words were forcing themselves out.
They wanted a weapon, so they treated me as such.
He turned to look at her, and Moon felt her heart break to see there were tears slipping down his cheeks.
Even my mother, though she loved me, had to treat me like dirt. She couldn't show me any kindness or affection in public, for fear that our keepers would think she was showing weakness to me. If they thought she was going soft, they would have taken me away from her without a moment's hesitation. So she had to watch, as I was beaten and downtrodden and abused at every opportunity. I often wondered, why doesn't she help me? You saw those scars on my back. Do you want me to tell you what those are for, Little Moon? I dared to tell one of my keepers that I didn't like being beaten to a pulp during combat training, so she had my own mother pin me to the floor whilst they flogged me!
A sob burst out of Moon's throat. She doubled over, unable to hold back her heart breaking a moment longer. The urge to stop him, to beg for no more, was strong. The words almost left her tongue. Darkstalker was crying too, staring into her eyes as he let the tears fall silently. Their tears mixed together in a small river on the floor. It felt wrong to turn away from him, to abandon him to this moment of trauma.
And through all that,
He whispered shakily.
Throughout it all, the only happiness I had in my life was fathom and clear sight. Every day, the only thing that got me through it was the promise in my visions that one day it would all be worth it. One day, I would have my happy ending.
There was a high-pitched shriek as his claws dug into the stone floor, leaving furrows as he clenched his talon into a fist. When he spoke again, his voice was little more than a hiss.
But then they had to ruin it. Favin wanted to run off with Indigo, and then resented me because I didn't want him to leave. And Clearsight grew suspicious of me because I fought in a war I had no say in.
What did you do?
Oh, so you haven't had your fill of death and tragedy?
He sneered.
Do you want me to tell you how I used my magic to terrible effect? That I made weapons that spat fire and thunder twice as far as any dragon could? Or how about the time we came across an enemy encampment and I magically poisoned the water so they all choked on their own lungs? Or maybe you want the details of how the Queen made me torture an Icewing for information. I told her I could just enchant them to tell me the truth, but she wanted it to be drawn out. She wanted to hear them squeal, like a pig. I want to hear them squeal like pigs, she said. She liked it when I got angry. She liked me when I used my magic to devastating effect.
Like this?
She held up one parchment she'd thrown at him, one she'd found before he'd arrived.
You didn't need her help here. It was after your mother died. It says you came up with a suggestion to cast a spell that would kill all the Icewings in the Ice Kingdom. It was only on Clearsight's adamant advice that you relented.
I'd watched my own mother die right before my eyes. Because I wasn't ruthless enough to kill the enemy. Because I wasn't fast enough to save her. Because I didn't tell her I was invulnerable!
So you would kill dragonettes? No, Darkstalker, that's not you.
Now you think you know me enough to make that judgment?
I know you're not a murderer!
That's what your little idiot thinks. He told you I killed my father and the Queen, remember? That must prove I'm a monster!
His tail lashed behind him, nearly splintering an old chair in the corner. He paid it no mind.
I killed my father because he was going to destroy the tribe, and I turned on that old harpy because I'd lost everything. My dragonet was stolen from me. My body had been violated. My mother was dead, my lover nearly assassinated, my sister almost taken, and then Vigilance wanted me dead too! I'd been patient. I'd been merciful. But I'd had enough. I have love in me the likes you can scarcely imagine, and rage the likes of which you could not believe. If I cannot satisfy one, I will indulge the other.
And when he loomed before her, angry and hurt from all he told her, she could believe it. In a flash, her friend was gone, and she saw him through the lens of what the program had built. She saw the wings that were bigger than average, the claws that were wickedly long and serrated, a long torso bent in the middle to give him a more serpentine look. His chest and shoulders were narrow for aerodynamics, but there was a natural strength to him that belied his appearance. It was only then she saw how everything about him was designed to be the perfect killing machine. How could she have missed all this until now? As if sensing her fear, Darkstalker sat down heavily, wings flopping lifelessly to the ground. He swallowed thickly, trying to stop his tears. Behind Moon, it began to rain, the drops pattering through the broken window and soaking her back. The cold, moist trail the droplets left across their scales made her shiver. The pair of them sat in silence for several minutes.
And after all that,
Darkstalker finally whispered in a hoarse voice.
After everything I had been through, what was my final reward? To be buried in the earth for 2,000 years, to awaken in the dark, unable to move, and to be completely and utterly alone.
Finally, Moon found the ability to move. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her approach was cautious, as if she were approaching a bear in a trap. But he wasn't looking at her, head bowed and eyes squeezed shut against the tears. Moon sniffled and reached out a talon to take hold of his claws in hers and give him a gentle squeeze.
Oh, Darkstalker.
Is that enough? Are you finally satisfied?
He demanded in a hollow voice.
It was never about satisfaction. It was about trust.
She tried not to take it personally when he moved his talon away from hers.
If you had only told me all this before, I would have accepted it. I would never have judged you for it. But instead you kept it from me.
To save you from this!
He pounded his chest once with his palm. Lifting his head, he stared down at her from the corner of one eye.
Can you even dare to look at me after all you've heard? Oh yes, I must look like quite the monster now, mustn't I? Your monster. Condemned for all eternity for the mistakes he couldn't escape from.
You know that's not what I think.
Oh, really? Because it seems to me that you've appointed yourself my judge and jury. Are you to be my new keeper now? To watch my every move and be sure it is up to your standards?
Her temper flared at the comparison that she was anything like his abusers.
All of this was to prove you were innocent.
You're supposed to be my friend. We're the same. 2 dragons turned into weapons by our tribe.
The difference between us is that I didn't give up and go along with it.
Of course, Moonwatcher. Instead, you became a broken little thing made weak by a monstrous father you should hate, but are too attached to due to some misguided, juvenile wish to please and be loved.
Moon froze, staring. It took Darkstalker a moment to realize what he'd done. The horrible words he'd spoken. How he'd called her Moonwatcher. Pain lanced through Moon's heart, sharper than any sword, more bitter than any poison. It was as if he'd taken all the little secrets of her soul and torn them up right in front of her. She saw the moment he realized his mistake, saw the shock and horror on his face. He reached for her, an apology instantly pouring from his lips.
I'm sorry,
But she didn't want to hear it. Bursting into tears, Moon turned on her heel and ran out the door.